Man, writes Lauren Isley, is the cosmic orphan. Other creatures have instincts to guide them, but man has learned to ask questions. Who am I? He asks. Why am I here? Where am I going? Well, ever since the Enlightenment, when modern man threw off the shackles of religion, he's tried to answer those questions without reference to God. But the answers that came back were not exhilarating, but dark and terrible. You are the accidental byproduct of nature, a result of matter plus time plus chance. There is no reason for your existence. All you face is death. Modern man thought that in getting rid of God, he had freed himself from everything that oppressed and stifled him. Instead, he unwittingly discovered that in killing God, he had also killed himself. For if there is no God, then man's life becomes ultimately absurd. If God does not exist, then man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Like all biological organisms, man must eventually die. With no hope of immortality, man's life leads only to the grave. Compared to the infinite stretch of time, man's life is but an infinitesimal moment, a spark that appears, flickers, and then dies forever. And yet this is all the life that he will ever know. And therefore, every individual has to come face to face with what the theologian Paul Tillich has called the threat of non-being. For even though I know now that I exist, that I am alive, that I am here, we also know that someday I will no longer exist, that I will cease to be, that I will die. And this thought is staggering and threatening, to think that the person I call myself, who is so alive and real today, will someday die and no longer exist. I can remember very vividly the first time my father told me as a child that someday I was going to die. Somehow as a child the thought had just never occurred to me. And when he told me, I was just overwhelmed with an unbearable fear and sadness, and I cried and cried and cried. And although my father tried repeatedly to reassure me that this event was a long way off, to me that just didn't matter. The fact was that I was going to die and would be no more. And that thought just overwhelmed me. Eventually, like all of us, I grew to accept the fact. We all learn to live with the inevitable. But I think that the child's insight remains true. As the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre observed, several hours or several years make no difference once you have lost eternity. And the universe, too, faces a death of its own. Scientists tell us that the universe is expanding, and everything in it is growing farther and farther apart. As it does so, it grows colder and colder, and its energy is used up. Eventually, all the stars will burn out, and all matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no light at all. There will be no heat. There will be no life. Only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies, ever expanding into the endless darkness and the cold recesses of space. A universe in ruins. The entire universe marches irreversibly toward its grave. So not only is each individual person doomed, the entire human race is doomed. The universe is plunging toward inevitable extinction. Death is written throughout its structure. There is no escape. There is no hope. If there is no God, then, man and the universe are doomed. Like prisoners condemned to death row, we simply wait for our unavoidable execution. There is no God. There is no immortality. And what is the consequence of this? It means that the life that we do have is ultimately absurd. It means that the life we live is without ultimate significance, ultimate value, ultimate purpose. let me say a word about each one of these. First, there is no ultimate meaning without immortality and God. If each individual person passes out of existence when he dies, then what ultimate significance can be ascribed to his life? Does it really matter whether he ever existed at all? Now, someone might say, well, perhaps his life was important because it affected others or changed the course of history. But that only shows a relative significance to his life, not an ultimate significance. Sure, his life may be important relative to certain other events. But what is the ultimate significance of influencing any of those events? If all of the events are meaningless, then what is the ultimate significance of influencing any of them? Ultimately, it makes no difference. Or look at it from another perspective. Scientists say that the universe originated in a cosmic explosion called the Big Bang about 15 billion years ago. Suppose the Big Bang had never occurred. Suppose the universe had never come into existence. What ultimate difference would it make? The universe is doomed to die anyway. In the end, it makes no difference whether the universe ever existed or not. It is therefore without ultimate significance. And the same is true of the human race. Mankind is a doomed race in a dying universe. Because the human race will eventually cease to exist, it makes no ultimate difference whether it ever did exist. Mankind is thus no more significant than a swarm of mosquitoes or a barnyard of pigs. The same blind cosmic process that coughed them all up in the first place will eventually swallow them all up again. And the same is true of each individual person. The contributions of the scientist to the advance of human knowledge, the researches of the doctor to alleviate pain and suffering in the world, the efforts of the diplomat to secure peace in the world, the sacrifices of good men everywhere to better the lot of the human race. In the end, all of these come to nothing. In the end, they don't make one bit of difference, not one bit. Each person's life is therefore without ultimate significance. And because our lives are ultimately meaningless, the activities that we fill our lives with are also ultimately meaningless. The long hours spent in study at the university, our jobs, our interests, our friendships, all of these are in the final analysis utterly meaningless. This is the horror of modern man. Because he ends in nothing, he ultimately is nothing. But it's important to see that it's not just immortality that man needs in order for life to be meaningful. Mere duration of existence is not sufficient to make that existence meaningful. To illustrate, I once read a science fiction story in which an astronomer, or rather an astronaut, was marooned on a barren chunk of rock lost somewhere in outer space. And he had with him two vials, one containing poison and the other a potion for immortality. Realizing his predicament, he gulped down the vial of poison. And then he realized to his horror that he had drunk the wrong vial. He had swallowed the potion for immortality. And thus he was cursed to exist forever, a meaningless, empty, futile life. Now, in the same way, if God does not exist, our lives are just like that. They could go on forever, and we could still ask of life, so what? So it's not just immortality that man needs if life is to be ultimately meaningful. It is God and immortality. And if God does not exist, then he has neither. 20th century man came to understand this. Read a play like Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. During this entire play, two men carry on trivial, mind-numbing, banal conversation while waiting for a third man to arrive who never does. And our lives are like that, Beckett's saying. We just kill time waiting. For what? We don't know. In a tragic portrayal of man, Beckett wrote another play in which the curtain opens, revealing a stage littered with junk. And for 30 long seconds, the audience sits and stares in silence at that junk. And then the curtain closes. That's all. French existentialists Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus understood this as well. Sartre portrays life in his play, No Exit, as hell. The final line of the play is the words of resignation, well, let's get on with it. And thus, Sartre writes elsewhere of the nausea of existence. Man, he says, is adrift in a boat without a rudder on an endless sea. Camus also saw life as absurd. At the end of his brief novel, The Stranger, Camus' hero discovers in a flash of insight that the universe has no meaning and that there is no God to give it one. The French biochemist Jacques Monod seemed to echo these sentiments when he wrote in his book Chance and Necessity, man finally knows that he is alone in the indifferent immensity of the universe. Thus, if there is no God, then life itself becomes meaningless. Man and the universe are without ultimate significance. Secondly, there is no ultimate value without God and immortality. If life ends at the grave, then it makes no ultimate difference whether you live as a Stalin or as a saint, since your destiny is ultimately unrelated to your behavior. You may as well just live as you please. As Dostoevsky put it, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. On this basis, a writer like Ayn Rand is absolutely correct to praise the virtues of selfishness. Live totally for self. No one holds you accountable. Indeed, it would be foolish to do anything else, because life is too short to jeopardize it by acting out of anything but pure self-interest. Sacrifice for another person would be stupid. Kai Nielsen, an atheist philosopher who attempts to defend the viability of ethics without God, in the end admits, and I quote, "We have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that all really rational persons, unhoodwinked by myth or ideology, need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality." But the problem becomes even worse. For regardless of immortality, if there is no God, then there can be no objective standards of right and wrong. All we are confronted with is, in Jean-Paul Sartre's words, the bare, valueless fact of existence. Moral values are either just expressions of personal taste, or else the byproducts of socio-biological evolution and conditioning. In the words of one humanist philosopher, the moral principles that govern our behavior are rooted in habit and custom, feeling and fashion. In a world without God, who's to say which values are right and which values are wrong? Who's to judge that the values of an Adolf Hitler are inferior to those of a saint? The concept of morality loses all meaning in a universe without God. As one contemporary non-theistic ethicist points out, to say that something is wrong because it is forbidden by God is perfectly understandable to anyone who believes in a law-giving God. But to say that something is wrong, even though no God exists to forbid it, is not understandable. The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. In a world without God, there can be no objective right and wrong, only our culturally and personally relative, subjective judgments. That means that it is impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil. Nor can you praise love, equality, or brotherhood as good. For in a universe without God, good and evil do not exist. There is only the bare, valueless fact of existence. And there is no one to say that you are right and I am wrong. Thirdly, there is no ultimate purpose without immortality in God. If death stands with open arms at the end of life's trail, then what is the end of life? To what goal has life been? Is it all for nothing? Is there no reason for life? And what of the universe? Is it utterly pointless? Is there no reason for the existence of the universe? If its destiny is a cold grave in the recesses of outer space, then the answer is that it is pointless. There is no goal, no purpose, no reason for the universe. The litter of a dead universe will just go on expanding and expanding forever. And what of man? Is there no purpose at all for the human race? Or will it just peter out someday, lost in the oblivion of an indifferent universe? The English writer H.G. Wells foresaw such a prospect. In his novel, The Time Machine, Wells' time traveler journeys far into the distant future in order to discover the destiny of man. And all he finds is a dead earth, except for a few lichens and moss orbiting a gigantic red sun. The only sounds he hears is the ripple of the sea and the gentle sound of the wind. Beyond these lifeless sounds, writes Wells, the world was silent. Silent? It would be hard to convey the stillness of it. All the sounds of man, the bleating of sheep, the cries of birds, the hum of insects, the stir that makes the background of our lives, all that was over. And so Wells' time traveler returned. But to what? To just an earlier point on the purposeless rush towards oblivion. When as a non-Christian I first read Wells' novel, I thought, no, it can't end this way. But this is reality in a universe without God. It will end that way, like it or not. I'm reminded of T.S. Eliot's haunting lines, "This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper." And what is true of mankind as a whole is also true of each of us individually. We are here to no purpose. If there is no God, then your life is not qualitatively different from that of a dog. Now, I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. As the ancient writer of Ecclesiastes put it, the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over the beast. For all is vanity. All go to the same place. All are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. In this book, which reads more like a piece of modern existentialist literature than a book from the Bible, the author shows the futility of a life doomed to end in death, even given pleasure, wealth, education, political fame, and honor. His verdict: vanity of vanities. all is vanity. If life ends at the grave, then we have no ultimate purpose for living. But more than that, even if life did not end at the grave, without God, life would still be without purpose. For man and the universe would then be simple accidents of chance, thrust into existence for no purpose. Without God, the universe is the result of a chance explosion, a cosmic accident. There is no reason why it exists. As for man, he's a freak of nature, a blind product of matter plus time plus chance. There is no more purpose in life for the human race than there is for a species of insect. For both are the result of the blind interaction of chance and necessity. As one philosopher has put it, human life is mounted upon a subhuman pedestal and must shift for itself alone in the heart of a silent and mindless universe. And what is true of the universe and of the human race is also true of us as individuals. Insofar as we are individual human beings, we are the result of certain combinations of heredity and environment. We're the victims of a sort of genetic and environmental roulette. Psychologists, following Sigmund Freud, tell us that our actions are really the result of repressed sexual tendencies. Sociologists, following B.F. Skinner, argue that all of our choices are determined by conditioning, so that freedom is an illusion. Biologists like Francis Crick tell us that man is simply an electrochemical machine which can be manipulated by altering its genetic code. If God does not exist, then you are just a miscarriage of nature thrust into a purposeless universe to live a purposeless life. So if God does not exist, that means that man and the universe exist to no purpose, since the end of everything is death, and that they came to be for no purpose, since they are only the blind products of chance. In short, life is utterly without reason. We begin to understand the gravity of the alternatives before us. For if God exists, then there is hope for man. But if God does not exist, then all we are left with is despair. As one writer has put it, if God is dead, then man is dead too. Unfortunately, the mass of mankind does not realize this fact, and so they continue on as though nothing had changed. I'm reminded of a story told by Friedrich Nietzsche of the madman who, in the early morning hours, burst into the marketplace, lantern in hand, crying, "I seek God! I seek God!" Since those standing about did not believe in God, he provoked much laughter. "Maybe God got lost," they taunted him, or "perhaps he is hiding," or "maybe he's gone on a voyage or immigrated." And thus they yelled and laughed. And then, writes Nietzsche, the madman turned in their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions. Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? God is dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? The crowd stared at the madman in silence and astonishment. At last, he dashed his lantern to the ground. "I have come too early," he said. "This tremendous event is still on its way. It has not yet reached the ears of men." Men did not truly comprehend what they had done in killing God. But Nietzsche predicted that someday people would realize the implications of their atheism. And this realization would usher in an age of nihilism. That is, the destruction of all meaning and value in life. The end of Christianity, wrote Nietzsche, means the advent of nihilism. This most gruesome of guests is standing already at the door. Our whole European culture is moving for some time now, wrote Nietzsche, with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as toward a catastrophe, restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that is afraid to reflect. Most people still do not realize the consequences of atheism. And so, like the crowd in the marketplace, they go unknowingly on their way. But when we realize, as Nietzsche did, what atheism implies, then his question presses hard upon us. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? About the only solution that the atheist can offer is that we simply face the absurdity of life bravely and go on living. Bertrand Russell, for example, wrote that we must build our lives upon the firm foundation of unyielding despair. Only by recognizing that the world really is a terrible place can we successfully come to terms with life. Camus said that we should honestly recognize the absurdity of life and then live in love for one another. But the fundamental problem with this solution is that it is impossible to live consistently and happily within the framework of such a worldview. If one lives consistently, then he will not be happy. If one lives happily, it is only because he is not consistent. Francis Schaeffer has explained this point very well. Modern man, says Schaeffer, lives in a two-story universe. In the lower story is the finite world without God. Here, life is absurd, as we have seen. In the upper story are God, and here reside meaning, value, and purpose. Modern man lives in the lower story because he does not believe in God. But he cannot live happily in such an absurd world. And so he continually makes leaps of faith into the upper story to affirm meaning, value, and purpose for his life, even though he has no right to such a belief because he does not believe in God. Modern man is totally inconsistent in making this leap because such values cannot exist without God. And man in the lower story does not have God. I'd like to look again, then, at each of those three areas in which we saw that life is absurd without God, and show how modern man cannot live consistently and happily with his atheism. First, then, the area of meaning in life. We saw that without God, life has no ultimate meaning. And yet, philosophers continue to live as though life did have meaning. For example, Sartre argued that one may create meaning for his life by freely choosing to follow a certain course of action. Sartre himself chose Marxism. Now, this is utterly inconsistent. It is inconsistent to say that life is objectively meaningless, and then to say that one may create meaning for his life. If life really is absurd, then man is trapped in the lower story. To try to create meaning to life is a leap into the upper story. But Sartre has no basis for such a leap. Without God, there can be no objective meaning to life. Sartre's program is thus really an exercise in self-delusion. For the universe doesn't really acquire a meaning just because I happen to give it one. I think this is easy to see. For suppose you give the universe one meaning and I give it another one. Who's right? Well, I think the obvious answer is neither one. For the universe in itself remains objectively meaningless, regardless of how we happen to look at it. Sartre is really saying, let's pretend the universe has meaning. And that is just fooling yourself. The point is this: if God does not exist, then life is objectively meaningless. But man cannot live as though his life were without any significance. And so in order to be happy, he pretends that life has meaning. But this, of course, is entirely inconsistent. For without God, man and the universe are without any real significance. Turn now to the problem of value in life. Here is where the most blatant inconsistencies occur. First of all, atheistic humanists are totally inconsistent in affirming the values of love and human brotherhood. Camus has been rightly criticized for inconsistently holding both to the absurdity of life and to the traditional values of human love and brotherhood. The two are logically incompatible. Bertrand Russell, too, was inconsistent. For though he was an atheist, he was also an outspoken social critic, denouncing war and restrictions on sexual freedom. Russell admitted that he could not live as though ethical values were simply a matter of personal taste, and that therefore he found his own views, and I quote, incredible. I do not know the solution, he confessed. The point is that if there is no God, then objective right and wrong cannot exist. As Dostoevsky said, all things are permitted. But Dostoevsky also showed that man cannot live that way. He cannot live as though it's perfectly all right for soldiers in Bosnia to slaughter innocent children. He cannot live as though it's all right for dictatorial regimes to follow a systematic program of physical torture of political prisoners. He cannot live as though it's perfectly all right for a dictator like Pol Pot to ruthlessly commit genocide against his own people. Everything in him cries out to say that these acts are wrong, really wrong. But if God does not exist, then he cannot. And so he makes a leap of faith to affirm values anyway. And in so doing, he reveals the inadequacy of a world without God. The horror of a world devoid of moral value was brought home to me in a new way several years ago as I watched a BBC television documentary called The Gathering. It concerned the reunion of survivors of the Holocaust in Jerusalem, where they rediscovered lost friendships and shared their experiences. Now, I had heard stories of the Holocaust before, and I've even visited camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, and I thought that I was beyond shocking by further tales of horror. But I found that I was not. One woman prisoner, a nurse, told of how she was conscripted to become the gynecologist at Auschwitz. And she observed that the pregnant women were taken together by the soldiers under the direction of Dr. Mengele and were housed in the same barracks. Some time passed, and she noticed that she no longer saw any of these women. She made inquiries. What happened to the pregnant women who were housed in that barracks? "Oh, haven't you heard?" came the reply. "Dr. Mengele used them for vivisection." Another woman told of how Mengele had bound up her breasts so that she could not suckle her infant. The doctor wanted to learn how long a baby could survive without nourishment. And desperately, this poor woman tried to keep her baby alive by giving it little morsels of bread soaked in coffee. But to no avail. Each day, the baby lost weight, a fact which was eagerly monitored by Dr. Mengele. Then one night, a nurse came secretly to this woman and told her, "I've arranged for a way for you to escape from the camp, but you cannot take your baby with you. I've brought a morphine injection which you can kill your baby with." And when this woman protested, the nurse said, "Look, your baby is going to die anyway. At least save yourself." And so this mother took the life of her own infant. My heart was torn as I heard these stories. One rabbi who survived the camp said that it was as though at Auschwitz there existed a world in which all of the 10 Commandments were reversed. Thou shalt lie, thou shalt kill, thou shalt steal. Mankind has never seen such a hell. And yet, in a sense, if there is no God, then our world is Auschwitz. All things are permitted. There is no right and wrong. But no atheist, no agnostic can live consistently with such a view. Nietzsche himself, who proclaimed the necessity of living beyond good and evil, broke with his mentor, Richard Wagner, precisely over the issue of the composer's virulent anti-Semitism and strident German nationalism. Similarly, Sartre, writing in the aftermath of the Second World War, condemned anti-Semitism, declaring that a doctrine which leads to the extermination of other people is not merely an opinion or matter of personal taste of equal value with its opposite. In his important essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre struggles vainly to elude the contradiction between his denial of divinely pre-established moral values and his urgent desire to affirm the value of human persons. Like Russell, he could not live with the logical implications of his own denial of absolutes. A second problem is that if God does not exist, and there is no immortality, then all of the evil acts of men go on unpunished, and all of the good acts of men go unrewarded. Richard Wurmbrand, who has been tortured for his faith in communist prisons, has written, "The cruelty of atheism is hard to believe when man has no faith in the reward of good or the punishment of evil. There is no reason to be human. There is no restraint from the depths of evil which is in man." The communist torturers often said, "There is no God, no hereafter, no punishment for evil. We can do what we wish." I have even heard one torturer say, "I thank God, in whom I don't believe, that I have lived to this hour when I can express all the evil in my heart." He expressed it in unbelievable brutality and torture inflicted on prisoners. The English theologian Cardinal Newman once remarked that if he believed that all of the evils and injustices of life throughout history were not to be made right by God in the afterlife, why, I think I should go mad. Rightly so. And the same applies to acts of self-sacrifice as well. A number of years ago, a terrible midwinter air disaster occurred in which a plane leaving the airport in Washington, D.C. smashed into a bridge spanning the Potomac River. It plunged the passengers into the icy waters of the Potomac. And as the rescue helicopters came, attention was focused on one man who repeatedly passed by the rope ladder, pushing it to others so that they could be rescued instead of himself. 6 times he pushed the ladder away and passed it to other passengers. And when the helicopters came again, he was gone. He had freely given his life so that others might live. And the entire nation turned its eyes toward this man in respect and admiration for the noble act that he had done. And yet, if the atheist is right, that man was not noble. He did the stupidest thing possible. He should have gone for the rope ladder first, pushed others away, if necessary, in order to be saved. But to give up all the brief existence he would ever know for other people whom he didn't even know. Why? There can be no good reason for such a sacrifice for the atheist. And yet even the atheist, like the rest of us, instinctively reacts with praise for this man's selfless action. Indeed, one will probably never find an atheist or agnostic who lives consistently with his worldview. For a universe without moral accountability and devoid of value is unimaginably terrible. Finally, let's look at the area of purpose in life. About the only way that most people who deny purpose in life manage to live happily is either by making up some purpose for their life, which amounts to self-delusion, as we saw with Sartre, or else by not carrying out their views to its logical consequence. Take the problem of death, for example. According to the psychologist Ernst Bloch, the only way that modern man lives in the face of death is by subconsciously borrowing the belief in immortality which his forefathers held to, even though he himself has no basis for this belief since he does not believe in God. Bloch states that the belief that life ends in nothing is hardly, in his words, sufficient to keep the head high and to work as if there were no end. By borrowing the remnants of a belief in immortality, writes Bloch, modern man does not feel the chasm which unceasingly surrounds him and that will certainly engulf him at last. Through these remnants, he saves his sense of self-identity. Through them, the impression arises that man is not perishing, but only that one day the world has the whim no longer to appear to him. Bloch concludes this quite shallow courage feasts on a borrowed credit card. It lives from earlier hopes and the support that they had once provided. But, of course, modern man no longer has any right to that hope since he rejects God. But in order to live purposely, he makes a leap of faith to affirm a reason for living. And we often find the same inconsistency among those who say that man and the universe came to exist for no reason or purpose, but just by chance. Unable to live in a universe that is utterly impersonal, in which everything is the product of blind chance, these people begin to ascribe personality and motives to the physical processes themselves. It's a bizarre way of speaking, and it represents a leap from the lower to the upper story. For example, the brilliant Russian physicists Zolgovich and Novikov, in contemplating the properties of the universe, ask, why did nature choose to create this universe rather than another? Nature has obviously here become a sort of God substitute, filling the role and function of God, the Creator. Similarly, Francis Crick, halfway through his book, The Origin of the Genetic Code, begins to spell nature with a capital N, and elsewhere speaks of natural selection as being clever and as thinking of what it will do. Fred Hoyle, the English astronomer, ascribes to the universe itself the qualities of God. For the late Carl Sagan, the cosmos, which he always spelled with a capital letter, obviously fills the role of a God substitute. Though all of these men profess not to believe in God, they smuggle in a God substitute through the back door because they cannot bear to live in a universe in which everything is the chance result of impersonal forces. And it's interesting to see many of these same thinkers betray their conclusions when pushed to their logical implications. For example, certain feminists have raised a storm of protest over Freudian sexual psychology because they say it's chauvinistic and degrading to women. And some psychologists have knuckled under and revised their theories. Now, this is totally inconsistent. If Freudian psychology is really true, then it doesn't matter if it's degrading to women. You can't change the truth because you don't like what it leads to. But people cannot live consistently and happily in a world in which other people are devalued. But, of course, if God does not exist, then nobody has any value. A woman would have no more rights than a female goat or a chicken has rights. In nature, whatever is right. Thus, one cannot consistently support women's rights unless God exists. But who can live with such a devaluing worldview? Well, apparently not even Freudian psychologists, who change their theories when pushed to their logical implications. Or take the sociological behaviorism of a man like B.F. Skinner. This view leads to the sort of society envisioned by George Orwell in his novel 1984, where the government controls and programs the thoughts of everybody. If Pavlov's dog can be made to salivate when a bell rings, so can a human being. If Skinner's theories are right, then there can be no objection to treating people like the rats in Skinner's rat box as they run through their mazes, coaxed on by food and electric shocks. According to Skinner, all of our actions are determined anyway. And if God does not exist, then no moral objection can be raised against this kind of programming, because man is not qualitatively different from a rat, since both are the result of matter plus time plus chance. But again, who can live with such a dehumanizing worldview? Or finally, take the biological determinism of a man like Francis Crick. The logical conclusion of this view is that man is like any other laboratory specimen. The world was horrified when it learned that at camps like Dachau, the Nazi scientists had used prisoners for medical experiments on living human beings. But why not? If God does not exist, then there can be no moral objection to using people as human guinea pigs. A memorial at Dachau says, "Nie wieder," never again. But this sort of thing continued to go on. It was revealed several years ago, for example, that in the United States, following the war, during the 1950s, several groups of blacks in southern states were injected, unknown to them, with a sterilization drug by medical researchers. Mustn't we protest that man is more than just an electrochemical machine? That this sort of experimentation is wrong? The end of this view is population control, in which the weak and the unwanted are killed off to make room for the strong. But the only way we can consistently protest this view is if God exists. Only if God exists can there be purpose in life. The dilemma facing modern man is thus truly terrible. And insofar as so-called postmodern man also denies the existence of God and the objectivity of value and purpose, this dilemma remains unrelieved for postmodernism as well. Indeed, it is precisely the awareness that modernism issues inevitably in absurdity and despair that constitutes the anguish of postmodernism. In some respects, postmodernism just is the awareness of the bankruptcy of modernity. The atheistic view is insufficient to maintain a happy and consistent life. Man cannot live consistently and happily as though life were ultimately without meaning, value, or purpose. If we try to live consistently on the atheistic worldview, then we will not be happy. If we live happily, then it is only by giving lie to our worldview. Confronted with this dilemma, man flounders pathetically for some means of escape. In a remarkable address to the American Academy for the Advancement of Science in 1991, Dr. L.D. Rue, confronted with the predicament of modern man, boldly advocated that we deceive ourselves by means of some noble lie into thinking that we and the universe have value. Rue claims that the lesson of the past 2 centuries is that intellectual and moral relativism is profoundly the case. But he recognizes that the consequence of that realization is that the quest for personal wholeness or self-fulfillment and the quest for social coherence become radically independent of each other. This is because on the view of relativism, the search for self-fulfillment becomes radically privatized. Each person has to choose his own set of values and meaning. Rue says there is no final, objective reading on the world or the self. There is no universal vocabulary for integrating cosmology and morality. So he says if we are to avoid what he calls the madhouse option, where self-fulfillment is pursued by every person, regardless of social coherence, and if we are to avoid, on the other hand, what he calls the totalitarian option, where social coherence is imposed at the expense of personal wholeness, then he says we have no choice but to embrace some noble lie that will inspire us to live beyond selfish interests and so achieve social coherence. A noble lie, he says, is one that deceives us, tricks us, compels us to live beyond self-interest, beyond ego, beyond family, nation, and race. It is a lie because it tells us that the universe is infused with value, which is a great fiction, because it makes a claim to universal truth when there is none, and because it tells me not to live for my own self-interest, which is evidently false. But, says Rue, without such lies, we cannot live. This is the dreadful verdict pronounced over modern man. In order to survive, he must live in self-deception. But even the noble lie option is in the end unworkable. For how can you believe in those noble lies while at the same time believing in atheism and relativism? The more convinced you are of the necessity of the noble lie, the less able you are to believe in it. Like a placebo, the noble lie only works for those who believe that it is the truth. Once we have seen through the fiction, then the lie has lost its power over us. Thus, ironically, the noble lie cannot solve the human predicament for anyone who has come to see that predicament. The noble lie option therefore leads at best to a society in which an elitist group of Illuminati or enlightened ones deceive the masses for their own good by perpetuating the noble lie. But why should those of us who are enlightened go along with the masses in their deception? Why should we sacrifice self-interest for a fiction? If the great lesson of the past 2 centuries is moral and intellectual relativism, then why, if we could, should we pretend that we do not know this truth and live a lie instead? If somebody answers, well, for the sake of social coherence, then I will legitimately ask, why should I sacrifice my self-interest for the sake of social coherence? About the only answer that the relativist can give is that social coherence is in my best self-interest. But the problem with this answer is that self-interest and the interest of the herd plainly do not always coincide. Besides, if out of self-interest I do care about social coherence, the totalitarian option is always open to me. Forget the noble lie and maintain social coherence as well as my self-fulfillment at the expense of the personal wholeness of the masses. Generations of Soviet leaders who extolled the virtues of proletarianism while they rode in limousines and dined on caviar in their country dachas found this alternative quite workable. Now, Dr. Roux would undoubtedly regard such an option as repugnant. But you see, there lies the rub. Roux's dilemma is that he obviously values deeply both social coherence and personal wholeness for their own sakes. In other words, they are objective values, which according to his philosophy do not exist. He's already leapt to the upper story. And thus the noble lie option affirms what it denies, and thus refutes itself. But if atheism fails in this regard, what about biblical Christianity? Well, according to the Christian worldview, God does exist, and man's life does not end at the grave. And thus biblical Christianity provides the 2 necessary conditions for a meaningful, valuable, and purposeful life: God and immortality. According to biblical Christianity, we are significant because we are created in the image of God and made to know God forever. Moral values are rooted in the very nature of God Himself, and our moral duties are prescribed for us by God's divine commands. The purpose of life is to know God and to enjoy Him forever. And thus, biblical Christianity succeeds precisely where atheism breaks down. And thus, within the framework of a Christian worldview, we can live consistently and happily. Now, I want to make it very clear that nothing that I've said tonight in any way shows that biblical Christianity is true. But I think what I have done is to clearly spell out the alternatives. If God does not exist, then life is ultimately futile. If the God of the Bible does exist, then life is meaningful. Only the second of these 2 alternatives enables us to live consistently and happily. And therefore, it seems to me that even if the evidence for these 2 alternatives were absolutely equal, the rational person ought to choose biblical Christianity. That is to say, it seems to me positively irrational to prefer death, futility, and despair to life, meaningfulness, and happiness. And therefore, it seems to me that the rational man ought to choose to believe in biblical Christianity. As Pascal said, we have nothing to lose and infinity to gain.